Today I'm going to present a brief introduction to ecological policy and how it might apply in your background and activities. Just to give you an idea of what I mean by ecological policy, let me give you a few examples of the kind of case studies that we typically cover in this area. First, as one example, is the case study of whales and whaling and what should be the appropriate public policy. And this is an example of a case study where science has a role, but it's a relatively minor role. This case study, this policy case study, is fundamentally a clash of competing values. There really isn't any right or wrong answer, but it's people's values that really define where they stand from a policy perspective. A second example of a case study involving policy questions is wildfire, forest fire management. And this is obviously a big item, particularly, well, really worldwide, but in the U.S., particularly in the western U.S. And this is another issue, another case study where science has an important role, but it's just one role of many aspects. And for example, one of the real problems you have now is that there's a lot of human development in the so-called wildfire interface, urban interface area. And so you have situations where what might be practical to do in a remote area, remote forest, is not really practical from a policy perspective in an area where the landscape is dotted by human development. So this is another example of a typical ecological policy question that will be considered. Another example, very common one, is what kind of response should the public have or government have to the climate change issue? And climate is clearly changing. There's really no argument about that. The technical argument in part is about what degree of importance is the human component of that. And clearly there's some human component, but it's not 100% for sure. So from a science perspective, there are a number of issues. There are still technical debates. But what's not clear, even if you agree on the science, whatever science you agree on, you've got really competing issues that are very important and difficult to resolve. Here, for example, you have a lithium mine. And if your policy option is to go for the battery storage, the electricity by renewables and so forth, where you have to store energy, you need lithium. And lithium comes from some politically less than stable places, as well as the fact that the U.S. has very limited deposits of lithium. And the two that are major are not in areas that are going to be extracted easily. One is in Death Valley and the areas around Death Valley, and the other is in the Salton Sea. And the Salton Sea is very, very low grade, and so it requires some intensive mining. And so unless you want to rely on sources of lithium from places that are politically unreliable, it results in some difficult policy choices. So these three are examples. They're certainly not the only examples. There are many others, and you can all think about those, but they're the type of things we mean, type of case studies when we say ecological policy. Now, science students or even natural resource students, when they're first confronted with policy questions, over the years when I've taught a graduate course in ecological policy, I've watched the reaction of students when they first get introduced to ecological policy. And I would say in the extreme, they tend to fall into one of two camps. The first camp are those who essentially say, look, we're science students, or maybe we're natural resource managers, fisheries, wildlife, forestry managers. We ought to avoid policy like the plague. I mean, it's just nothing good comes from it. Avoid it. Along those lines, they might say, if the public or decision makers, policy makers are interested in science, they can read the literature, the peer-reviewed scientific literature. That's the best of the available science, and if they're really interested, they ought to read that. And they also might say things like all these political policymakers, particularly the elected ones, all they want to do is feed off our credibility to help themselves get reelected. So we shouldn't really get involved because it's helping out those people for things that aren't necessarily in the public interest. Further, at the other extreme, and this is again, these are extremes, probably no one's at the complete extreme, but other students would argue that, no, we have a moral obligation to advocate for good policies. And by implication, we, the scientists, we, the students, we can decide what's good policy. Students might also say at this extreme that we are in a unique position as scientists to decide ecological policy. And so because we are in this unique position, we are scientific experts after all, we should decide policy. They might also say, some of them, hey, I chose this major, I'm majoring in whatever, to help advocate for my personal policy preferences. And so the reason I developed this scientific expertise is to help me sell, help me market my personal policy preferences. And that's what I'm going to do. Now, most students, the reality of life is that they recognize that there's some role for scientists that's desirable from a public policy standpoint. But exactly what is that role? What are the limitations? Where does science stop and advocacy begin? That's the area that tends to get confusing if you're trying to play by the rules, if you will. Well, first, a few key definitions. And these definitions, there's no right or wrong definitions, but I give you these to make sure that we use these words, we're talking about the same thing. First definition. A policy is nothing more than a decision or plan of action for accomplishing something, some desired outcome. So the key with a policy is there needs to be a goal. Now that goal could be ambiguous, it could be unclear, it could be open for debate, but there's something that is trying to be accomplished. Second, a policy maker, sometimes called a decision maker, is a person who selects from competing and various policy options. And that's usually an elected official or perhaps a senior bureaucrat who's appointed by an elected official. They take their mandate, if you will, indirectly from the voters. So in theory, the voters are saying, broadly speaking, here's what we want done. And then policymakers, elected people, will make the choices from the various options. Now that's in contrast to a manager or natural resource manager or ecological manager, because managers carry out, they execute policy. So they're not going to be in general deciding policy except on a relatively low level. They will be executing a policymaker that's either made directly by elected officials and or their designees. Policy advocate. And that policy advocate is an organization or a person who's actually actively pushing a particular policy or perhaps a class or type of policies. Now, there's nothing wrong with policy advocates. Policy advocates exist across the entire political spectrum, perfectly reasonable in a democracy, and that's how a democracy works. Either individually or through organizations, people push their policy preferences. So you want to be very careful that when you talk about policy advocates, you're talking about an advocate, say, versus a policymaker or versus a scientist or versus somebody else. Politics. Politics is simply the process of debate, negotiation, compromise for achieving the policy goal. And so that's the process by which society makes decisions. Now, a lot of people, particularly students in sciences, don't like this whole notion. It's messy, it's not logical, it's, there's a lot of compromise. I don't like it. Politics has a bad rap. But the reality is that's how decisions are made. Right or wrong, that's how things will be resolved. A policy preference. A policy preference is just a preferred option. Either you as an individual or your organization has a preferred option or perhaps a set of options from a larger group of policy choices or alternatives. Perfectly reasonable. We all have policy preferences. The most hardcore scientist has policy preferences. You'll never eliminate policy preferences because people have opinions about what should be done given a particular case study. A value. Now, a value differs from a policy preference in this regard. A value is really a core belief. It's an essential, broadly stated view of a person or group view on some topic. Now, values tend not to change over time. They usually tend to be more faith-based, more reliable. I think this is in general right. Whereas policy preferences can be influenced by science and other information. So values, you got to be very careful about this term. This is really a core belief, and it's expressed by people's choice of a policy preference. Scientist. Now, this is an important definition because it involves a lot of confusion. Here I'm going to use the classically narrow definition of a scientist, and that is a person who generates or interprets scientific information using the scientific method. Now, these days, commonly scientific information is called science. A lot of scientists don't like that use of the term because they think science is really defined as the scientific method, which I'll talk more about. It's a particular way to acquire knowledge. It is certainly not the only way to acquire knowledge. It's one way to acquire knowledge. But when we talk about scientists, that would be a person who is either reporting that type of information and or generating it. Science, the information itself. It's important to recognize that science is only one type of information, and the choice to gather scientific information versus the other ways to acquire information is a value choice. There is nothing right or wrong about that, but it is a value choice. Scientific information has four characteristics. It's rational, which means it relies on the senses. It's systematic. It's testable, that is, people can repeat it and do the studies. And it's reproducible. If you repeat the work, you're going to come up with the same answer within a range of statistical error. And if you don't, then it's back to the drawing board and test a different hypothesis. This is the so-called scientific method, and I'll talk more about this one a little bit later. Well, why is it that we, and by we I mean people who teach policy, professors and others, tend to overlook policy issues in natural resource management courses? A lot of students will say, you know, maybe I just was asleep that day, but I just don't remember covering these things in natural resource classes. Well, they don't tend to be covered in great detail. And over the years, I've asked students, but why is that? After you've been exposed to policy, why is it that you think you haven't had that type of information in the past? And I've digested the answer down to 5 reasons that students offer why it hasn't been covered in their education. First is, policy, once you get into it, involves multiple aspects. Science is only one aspect, and oftentimes it's not even the most important aspects. But if you're a student or a professor who's a scientist, that's the area of your comfort zone. So if you get into policy, you're talking about areas outside your comfort zone, and people don't tend to want to do that. Secondly is, policy really has kind of a touchy-feely flavor to it. It's a mixture of values and science. You're trying to stand back and figure out what's driving policy decisions, what are the core values, where are really the points of debate. It's not a real precise science, and a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. Another reason why these concepts don't tend to get covered in classes, particularly undergraduate classes, is that most ecological managers, natural resource managers, are technocrats. That is, they like to avoid, if they can, value issues because there's no right or wrong here. It's just faith-based, it's opinion. And so it's not a comfort zone. Science is tangible, you repeat it, you get the same answer. That's not true about value issues. And policy debates are not action-oriented. Sometimes policy debates go on for decades, if not longer. Technocrats, in my experience, like to get things done. They usually are driven by action. Let's just make a decision and move on with it. And that's great for a manager or a technocrat, but it's not great for a policy maker or even a policy analyst or even a scientist who's providing information to a policy debate. Also, in policy, there tends not to be a single right or wrong answer. There's really only a suite of choices, policy options. And a lot of times, each of these options has clear downside and clear opposition. So there's no really right answer that's going to make everybody happy. And that, we tend, just as people, tend to avoid those kinds of issues. Well, how does the science-policy interface work in the real world so far as scientists providing information? I mean, this is ideal. This tends to be what we tell students about policymaking and what the proper role of a scientist is. In the ideal world, we would expect something like this. As a scientist, you would provide relevant information, policy information that's germane to the policy question. Providing science to policymakers isn't a data dump about everything you know about the topic. It's providing the precise science that people need to help them make a decision. Secondly, we would tell scientists, students, be credible. People need to believe the information. Trust in scientists is crucial, so you want to be absolutely credible because people, once they lose trust, they won't believe it, and that's just unfortunately the reality. You need to be accurate as you can, because predictions and assessments need to be true. Now, it might take, if you predict something will happen if you adopt an option, it might take 5 years to prove that's true. And so, but again, once people conclude that your science isn't reliable, isn't predictable, doesn't work, you've got a credibility problem. You also need, as a scientist presenting information, to be balanced, and that is, you need to consider equally the full range of options being considered by the policymakers. You shouldn't commit the sin of omission by emphasizing options that you personally or your employer prefers. You want to be equal across the range of options that are on the table being considered. You also want to be very careful with presenting uncertainty. There's nothing in science that's absolute, and so you want to be sure that you convey uncertainty in an understandable way. It's not so much that you just provide a statistical confidence interval. It means that people understand what you're presenting, not just the fact that you gave an alpha value of 0.05. No one really knows that outside the scientific community. And you also want to be impartial just in everything you do. No hidden policy preference. Don't try to do an acute advocacy. No one, as a scientist, no one really cares about your opinion outside of the scientific area of expertise that you have. So stick to the science and no hidden policy preferences. Don't try to slip into trying to convince the policymakers or the public that one option is better than another. Okay, well, let's talk about this science policy interface, how it actually works. The list above says how we tell students and hope that it works. It's the idealized one. Let's talk about how it works in practice. First, in practice, and this is what I observed over my career, it's somewhat different. In fact, it's a lot different. And these lessons have been learned, I would say, in a relatively painful way. And the first key lesson is that policymaking is all about conflict. In fact, the process of policymaking is really the process by which society picks winners and losers. And unfortunately, anybody that tells you that there is a win-win out there is not being accurate. There are no win-wins in policy. There's compromise for sure, but all the choices on the table for any policy question involve winners and losers. All right, what are the commonly observed failures that I've seen over the years? First, a scientist presents information that's close to being relevant. It's great science, but it's not really the right policy question. Policymakers don't want to hear a download of all the science relative to the topic. They want to hear the science that's relevant to the policy question at hand. Secondly, scientists sometimes do provide great science right on track, but it's late. You missed the deadline. That would have been useful information 2 or 3 years ago, but meanwhile we made a choice and moved on, right or wrong. So while you did produce a great science, and that's fine, the timing was terrible. Or worse than that is the science that you provided turned out to be wrong. You said if we adopted option 3, for example, this are likely to be the consequences, and the consequences turned out to be different. Another one that's not sometimes the fault of the scientist is science gets misused. A lot of policy advocates will shop for helpful science, then wrap their policy pitch as they try to sell it. They wrap it in science. And so while a scientist usually isn't exactly to blame, the science could be misused by advocates. And much of the public and some decision makers aren't entirely clear who's a policy advocate and who's a scientist, because they can be interchangeable somewhat unless you're really used to looking out for these different roles. And there's also the issues, to be frank, of corrupted scientists. And I don't mean by scientists taking money under the table or fabricating data or anything like that. I mean policy advocates who masquerade as scientists. In other words, they look like scientists, they sound like scientists, they probably have science degrees, they call themselves scientists, but they in fact are policy advocates who just happen to be scientists. And there's, of course, the question of corrupted science itself, not the scientists, but science. And corrupted science is trickier sometimes to detect because this is science that's inculcated with policy preferences. That is, policy preferences are embedded in the science. Unless you're really experienced, you can't oftentimes pick up on that. Well, what is this last item, corrupted science, is really important to understand. So what is this science that's inculcated with policy preferences? Well, we need to go back to basically first principles here and revisit this issue about what exactly is science. Now, science was what we now know we treat as science was popularized by Francis Bacon 300 years ago, and it's not something. It's information, but it's information has four characteristics, as I mentioned. It's rational. That is, it relies on your senses. There's no faith based in science. It's rational. It's systematic. You can describe what you did. You follow a logical path. You may change the path, but people can follow exactly what you did. It's testable. That is, other people can repeat your studies. It's not something that relies on faith or just assumptions. Somebody else can go out and test it. And if they do test it, they do reproduce it, you come up with the same answer within a range of natural statistical error and other variation. So it's important to keep in mind that if the information doesn't have these four characteristics, it's not science. Now, it may be great information. It may be incredibly useful. It may be the most important information that policymakers use, but it's not science. And that leads to, what is it then? What it is what we call normative science. In fact, it's not regular or traditional science. It's called normative science because it has an embedded or hidden policy preference. The average listener, unless you're used to it, will not even pick up on it. It'll just slip right by and people will just say, well, it's science. But it's not science. It, in fact, is a form of advocacy, policy advocacy, because using it, the average listener, doesn't even realize that you're subtly pushing a policy preference. In fact, it's worse than that. It's really oftentimes called stealth policy advocacy because most listeners, don't even detect it. Now, in my experience, policymakers, particularly experienced ones, will detect it, but they're unusual. The average member of the public will not detect normative science. Well, let's look a little more carefully about normative science. The first time students get exposed to this, most reactions are something like, well, all science is obviously affected by human values, so isn't it impossible to make science value-free? That's actually true, completely true, because the decision to gather information according to the scientific method is a value choice. So science is not value-free. But it is not okay to embed a policy preference in the science itself. That, in fact, makes it normative science and not policy neutral science. So even though scientific enterprise is a value-driven activity, in fact should be policy neutral. Another aspect to consider is the question that often comes up that, look, no one really understands the scientist except for the individual scientists in that field. And even there, sometimes there's high degrees of specialty that people don't understand the nearby specialty. So it's an important issue is to maintain trust in science because people have to take it on faith. Trust me, I'm a scientist. I'm giving you impartial information. There's no subtle advocacy here. Now, the public, in some respects, is not stupid. I mean, they recognize that there are a lot of not impartial scientists. And these scientists can subtly be pushing policy preferences through normative science and some other techniques. So how has the public trust changed over the years, and what is it right now about the trust and the impartiality of scientists? Now, several years ago, YouGov, among other things, asked this question in a national survey. How much do you, as an average person on the street, trust scientists to be accurate and reliable? That is, no question, no clarification about what kind of science or what kind of scientist, but just in general, how much do you trust the average scientist to be accurate and reliable? Now, you can speculate what the answer to this question is, but to me at least, it was rather shocking. 55%, that's more than half, had little or no trust in what scientists say is accurate and reliable. That's more than half. It's more than half. Worse than that, in my perspective, trust level from the public at large, 29%, less than a third, said that scientific studies rarely or never are influenced by political ideology. And that jargon is really what we're calling in this discussion policy bias. That is, less than a third looked at mostly science has a policy bias. Wow, talk about trust. That's kind of sobering. Well, how does normative science creep into policy deliberations? It really goes back to the Philosophy 101 issue about science deals with is, and policy making, decision making deals with ought or should. So how do you go from an is, which is what science deals with, to the ought, which is what policy making deals with? It's also couched in subtle terms, like scientists will often say their job is to inform the public, whereas policy advocates will say, I'm using science to influence the public, which really means I want the public or decision makers to adopt my policy preference. So normative science is essentially moving from the box on the left, the is, the informing box, into the influencing or ought box. Well, let me give an example here of what this means in practice. Imagine that you have a river here. Let's say it's out in the mountains around the California Central Valley, and this river on the left, has a salmon population, and there's lots of folks that fish for salmon, think it's pretty important. But there's also an issue in August. Water supplies in the Central Valley and Southern California and Central and Northern California get pretty scarce, and so August water is in short supply. So let's imagine there's a proposal on the table to put a dam on the river on the left to create the reservoir on the right. Now the idea would be in August you'll have this water stored and you could release it for irrigation and domestic use and so forth. And of course the other obvious concern is that the river on the left, the salmon run, will be altered, maybe even eliminated. So imagine you are a member of a science team that's job in life is to look at the ecological consequences of putting a dam on the river on the left to create the reservoir on the right. How would you describe the results? Again, you're a scientist, you're an expert on this topic, and there's no debate about what the effects will be, but how would you present the information to the public, to the governor, to others about the effects? Would you use terms like ecosystem degradation? If you do, I would assume that you would see that you have moved into normative science. Because if you do use terms like degradation, you've made the assumption that the condition of the river on the left, the ecosystem on the left, is preferred to the one on the right. Now it's clearly different. There's a big effect of putting a dam on a river or removing a dam. But it's not better or worse until you make a policy judgment. And that's outside the scope of science. So ecosystem degradation is an example of normative science. Or you could take the exact same information, no change in the information, and call it ecosystem improvement. Because after all, on the condition on the right, you'll have water in August, and those folks that want that water will be happy as a clam. Yeah, you'll lose salmon runs on the left, but you could argue that's the cost of doing business. All legitimate questions, but they're policy questions, not science. So the exact same science could be described as either ecosystem improvement or ecosystem degradation. Both are normative science. I think the preferred way to describe the effects would be something like ecosystem alteration. There is no doubt that there is going to be big changes by building a dam, but those changes are not good or bad until you overlay the preferred condition, the policy preference. So science would deal with words like ecosystem alteration, whereas advocacy would deal with words like degradation or improvement. Well, normative science, I find, is very common in policy debates. And here's another example. Look at the human health metaphor. We have societies, professional societies, that even have things like ecosystem health in their title. But the question I want to look at is the use of ecosystem health in science. Now, in policy advocates, they can use anything they want to help sell their policy preference. They have no rules to follow. It's strictly a marketing game. Okay, but in science, the question is ecosystem health really an example of normative science? Now, we all know the human health metaphor. At different levels, ages, this guy's maybe is 100. You can take a bunch of measurements and figure out that, hey, this guy for 100-year-old is pretty healthy, he's great shape, and so forth. You could take the same set of measurements for somebody at 10, and you could recalibrate those measurements for somebody that at 10 would be healthy, and the same for another human at 1. So the human health metaphor is broadly understood, is broadly accepted. There's obviously some limitations on the idea, but it's a simple, straightforward idea. Wouldn't it be neat, some people would argue, if we could take the same idea, the same metaphor, and apply it to ecosystems. In other words, you could go out to an ecosystem, just like we did for the human, take a bunch of measurements and determine if it's healthy. And if it's not healthy, we could recommend some changes to make it more healthy. So there's a lot of appeal to the idea. But let's look at it in practice. What are the attractive features for using ecosystem health in advocacy? First is, it works in policy conflicts. It helps sell preferences. When you say your position is healthy, that sounds like a good thing. People's instinct is, let's go with it. It's also intuitive appealing because it's an easy metaphor to explain to people. Everybody knows about healthy humans, and so if you apply that to ecosystems, same idea must be good. Advocates will also say that it focuses on a politically important, not technically important, but politically important. If you're making your pitch to protect an area because of some obscure species of slug, that's a hard sell politically. When you're telling people they're going to have to shut down their use of their property for some slug, that's a difficult political sell. But if you say it's to protect ecosystem health, that's a little more appealing. There's also an apparent scientific basis, just like, in human health. If we got a problem, we go into doctors and they give us some options and we choose from among those options and go for it. Same idea. If you've got an unhealthy ecosystem, you go to some scientists who will tell you what your options are and you go for it. And of course, scientists love this. If nothing else, it's guaranteed work. But there are problems with applying this metaphor in science, and I want to emphasize the problems are in science. Policy advocates can do whatever they want. They can use this technique all they want, but it's not an appropriate scientific concept in science. Let's look at it. Here are some examples of healthy ecosystems. Here we have a coastal wetland off Georgia. No effects of human activities. It's pretty much the way it's been forever, if you will. You could ask 100 people, and I think probably all 100 would say it's a healthy ecosystem. Or you could go up to Alaska and fly over some very, very remote country, these ponds, these mud holes, tundra and so forth. These have probably never been explored by humans, maybe a very limited amount. Certainly no effects that you can determine. Are these healthy ecosystems? Again, pretty much everybody will say, yeah, they're healthy ecosystems. Or go a little more south, go down into the Rocky Mountains, northern British Columbia. Here is a remote lake, probably never been visited or very little visited by humans. In fact, there's no trails to it. It's off the beaten path. No effects of humans can be detected, and no matter how rigorously you study this. Maybe a slight amount of airborne pollution from China, but not much. And that's even debatable. Is it healthy? Most people say yes. Closer to Corvallis, here's an example of old-growth forest, and spotted owls like this kind of habitat. Other bird species that like old-growth forest do well, and the species that normally do well in old-growth forests are doing well here. But let's look at this ecosystem. It does have the characteristics of an old-growth forest, and the species that you expect to be there are there. But let's turn 90 degrees to the left and look at the adjacent land. So it's basically the same land, just a fact that the trees have been removed. Now, in contrast to the old growth trees, this area, the deer and elk love it. There's a lot more forage. They're doing well. The species that like old growth forests are not doing so well. Which condition is healthier? Well, by this time you figured out that it depends what you want. If you want old growth forest, you could say the one on the right is healthier. And if you want maybe trees or lumber, timber, or you want deer or elk or some other species, you could say the one on the left's healthier. It depends on what you want. In other words, it's a value choice. Well, again, we're talking about ecosystem health that's used in science, not advocacy. Is it really all that bad when it's used in science? I say yes, because almost always the average listener will not even pick up on it. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, it's called stealth policy advocacy. So it's subtle advocacy, it's wrapped in science, but it isn't effectively advocacy masquerading as science. What possible reasons would scientists, now there's obvious reasons why advocates would use normative science, but why would scientists use normative science? First is unintentional. They don't even realize it. They're just ignorant of the whole idea. They're just not attuned to policy issues or value-based issues, or they're just not concerned. Hey, it's not my problem. They misinterpret my science. That's their problem. Another example is that scientists do have personal policy preferences, and they either cannot or will not compartmentalize those. And so basically, their personal policy preferences seep into their science, and as a result, you get this normative science. You also have disciplinary pressure, our scientific professions, if you will. Sometimes there's subtle coercion, peer pressure to go along. Hey, we're all in here to protect wildlife, and so there's subtle pressure on the scientists to embed that policy preference in their science. And there's also employment pressure. Almost all of us work for somebody. And so the somebody who's paying our salary, will set some broad policy goals perhaps. And, you got to be a team player, go along to get along, go with the flow. So that sometimes there's very overt pressures to use your position, your science to help sell the organization's policy preferences. Well, as a user of science, let's change hats here. Okay, imagine that you are a user of science. That is, you're a policymaker or a member of the general public, and you're the person at the end of the arrow here, and you're listening to this scientist in yellow, the yellow circle, present scientific information. The question you ought to ask is this scientist attempting to inform you or to influence you about the policy outcome? Ideally, that scientist is there to present policy-neutral science. It doesn't tend to subtly favor one versus another policy option. But sometimes a good scientist presenting this that's really becoming a good advocate it's very difficult to detect. And that's why policymakers, and to an extent the public, need to be attuned. Are you getting pitched a policy preference under the guise of science? And it's not that easy to tell sometimes. And this is the whole class of issues of called advocacy masquerading as science. It slips by most people unless they're experienced. Well, for scientists, let's move back to being a scientist here for the rest of this. What are the rules of engagement? Let's just say you are that person brought together to a panel to present the science relative to a particular issue. And this is a contentious issue because the mere fact you're having public hearings and so forth mean that there's a range of opinion and people are pretty vested in the outcome, some of the outcomes at least. I am not of the view to tell you that it's simple, follow these rules and you'll be good to go. That's not the case. It's challenging, and the more you get experience in it, the better you'll be at it. But when you start, it's not that easy. And my strong advice for people is to think about these issues before you get confronted with a difficult scientific or policy issue, because you do not want to be coming up with your formulations on the run. Now, these are some rules that I've learned over the years working at the science policy interface, and I want to stress this. These are based on my experiences, and they're not as clean and neat as I'm presenting them here. Sometimes they work, sometimes they didn't. So imagine you're the person in green up there presenting to the panel on the front table, and these are the policymakers. These are the ones that are going to vote on whatever the case study is. And in the audience, you have a group of people who are have most of the vested interest. They're the ones who will win or lose depending on which policy option is adopted. This can be and was a painful experience, but these are the lessons that I've learned on how scientists ought to play in this arena. Rule 1, play the science straight up. No game playing. Don't get into game playing. You're a scientist. Focus on it. Think your things through. Follow the physician advisor model. When you go in and talk to your physician, you think you've got some kind of problem, needs solution. Your physician will diagnose it, hopefully, give you a series of options. You could do A, B, or C. Here's likely to be the consequences of each one. If you want to minimize the likelihood of an adverse event, think about 2. If you want to take a flyer on this and go for broke, go for 3. They can give you an opinion on it, but at the end of the day, it's your choice. So as a scientist presenting in this example, be even-handed. Don't try to skew the decision makers or the public to one side or another. Rule 2, watch out for implicit policy preferences in your research or whatever you're presenting. Here's Charles Darwin, and Charles Darwin is famous for telling scientists to buck up and develop a heart of stone. In other words, you call the science the way it shows. Don't try to bend it to fit some contemporary policy preference. Guard against confirmation bias. Don't go out and do your science to try to show that something is true. Try to stand back and say you'll go with the data, not what you not trying to confirm a prior view of things. Rule 3, accept that policymakers covet political legitimacy. Policymaking is difficult because no one's going to be happy when they've got to make a choice and alienate a bunch of people who likely might vote against them next time. So there are competing and there are unpleasant value choices. Policymakers really have a tough job. Scientists just present the science. Here's what it says. You're the policymaker. You choose. I'm basically here to present straight up science. And don't fall for this. If you're a scientist presenting to a group and they say, well, you're the expert, tell us what we, the policymakers, ought to do. You are only the expert in your area of scientific expertise. That's it. That's probably 5% of the totality of the policy question. And so even though you're an expert in one narrow part of it, that's your only area of expertise. Your values, your policy preferences are no more important than anyone else's. Rule 4, acknowledge, understand that framing the policy question, largely defines the answer. Now, I've spent a good part of my career dealing with issues like salmon recovery and so on, but we also ran up against a lot of times people who had other priorities like public housing. In fact, public housing tends to get very unhappy about the fact that so much land is not buildable because of setbacks for streams to protect salmon. So, who says that public housing development, getting more land into the buildable category, is more important or less important than salmon? It's not for scientists to decide that. That's for the public or delegated through their elected officials to decide. We do not decide that salmon are more important than affordable housing or vice versa. Rule 5, avoid normative science and worse, stealth policy advocacy. Now, here's a golf course that I worked on years ago. As a member of a panel of scientists. And one of the things that the person who funded this review wanted us to do, I think, is to essentially say that this area was going to be healthy or unhealthy depending on the golf course being built. But the fact of life is, scientifically, neither condition, no golf course or with a golf course, is healthy or sick until you overlay a value preference. So an area like this should not be called degraded or improved in science. That's great for advocates to do. Policymakers can do that. But scientists ought to stick to the science. Rule 6. Remember that societal priorities change, and there's nothing wrong or right about that. For example, 100 years ago, the public paid people to kill wolves. Great. Public wanted them to be eradicated because they kill sheep, livestock, deer, other kinds of things that people valued. And now we spend a significant amount of effort to restore wolves, at least to some parts where they're eradicated. Neither is right or wrong. Science does not compel policy choices. Science will tell you what the consequences of each choice is. So remember that societal priorities change, and that's to be expected. That's not a scientific issue, that's just a public policy issue. Rule 7. Remember and appreciate that policymaking is tough, much tougher than science. Science on a scale of issues is relatively easy compared to policymaking. Because policymaking is all about picking winners and losers, and this by definition will be a divisive activity. And worse than that is don't fall for the trap when somebody tries to say this particular policy option is a win-win. There are no win-wins in policy. There's only compromise, and by definition that means that some people win and some people lose. Again, I'm a firm believer that policymaking is a lot more difficult, a lot tougher than doing pure science. Let me conclude with an example. Think back to the Pacific Northwest in 1948. And we had, the area had a big flood, flood up and down the coast all the way from British Columbia to Northern California. And this was, these big floods happen about every 30 or 40 years. And they're really not the routine decadal type floods, but these are really big ones. Well, what happened? 1948, Vanport, which was the second largest at the time, second largest city in Oregon, right next to Portland, got essentially washed away. The Columbia broke through the levees and basically washed away Vanport. The political pressure at the time, 1948-49, was solve this problem. This is another big flood. We had a bad one in 36. We had one in 1894, 1861. These are catastrophic floods, and there was a tremendous political pressure in 1948 and 49 to solve this problem. Well, how do you solve this problem? You solve this problem, at least the choice was to solve this problem, by building dams. Now, there's no doubt dams have been highly studied. The science about the effects on salmon are well known. There's no surprise here. Science was readily available, but the public pressure was do something. And as a result, from 1948, the early 50s, through 1984, a whole slew of dams were built up and down the Columbia, as well as the major tributaries, to try to control these floods. Now, was that a good choice? The science was helpful. It did say the effects on salmon would be thus and so, and you might want to consider building a hatchery or doing something else to reduce the effect, but they're going to be big effects. So the question you need to reflect on, as this example was this a good or bad choice? Essentially, it came down simplistically to, do you want salmon runs or do you want floods? People were well aware of the effects of these dams are going to have on salmon. They're also well aware of the fact that an undammed river can have big effects on flooding. Was it a good or a bad choice? Depends. I mean, science can help inform this decision, but at the end of the day, it's a question of what the public wants. Let me wrap up here. Welcome to the policy world. If you're going to get involved, I encourage you to do some thinking about your role as a scientist prior to confronting these issues. I think you can find them very challenging, interesting, rewarding, but also very surprising unless you're prepared and have thought through some of these issues. Thank you.